Welcome to part 6 of the essay, The Abolition of Work, written by Bob Black. Link above the entire playlist. In this video, I'm covering a section of passages from the essay that continue Bob's list of concerns with modern paid labor. But as we move through these sections, you will also notice that Bob has begun to round the corner from critiquing work to beginning to outline his recommendations for a world without work. As with most theorists and essayists, this is always the part of any argument where the wheels start to come off the bus, so to speak. While criticism is relatively easy as it can be proven through concrete fact and examples, proposing solutions requires an application of intellect to a situation entirely of the imagination. Unfortunately, our limited brains are not ideally suited to this task, and more often than not, even the best ideas overlook some horrifying consequences. So I'll try to approach Bob's ideas with an open mind, but I do stray into some criticism. Anyway, let's get to it. Quote, "Even if you aren't killed or crippled while actually working, you very well might be while going to work, coming from work, looking for work, or trying to forget about work. The vast majority of victims of the automobile are either doing one of these work obligatory activities or else fall afoul of those who do them. To this augmented body count must be added the victims of auto-industrial pollution and work-induced alcoholism or drug addiction. Both cancer and heart disease are modern afflictions normally traceable directly or indirectly to work. Work, then, institutionalized homicide as a way of life. People think the Cambodians were crazy for exterminating themselves. But are we any different? The Pol Pot regime at least had a vision, however blurred, of an egalitarian society. We kill people in the six-figure range, at least, in order to sell Big Macs and Cadillacs to the survivors. Our 40 or 50,000 annual highway fatalities are victims, not martyrs. They died for nothing, or rather, they died for work. But work is nothing to die for." Close quote. Let's look at the current statistics. According to the U.S. News in 2019, approximately 107,000 people die every year as a result of air pollution. 38,000 are killed in auto accidents and 4.4 million are injured. I don't know how many of these accidents involve commuting workers, but I have to assume the percentage is significant. According to the American Institute of Stress, 120,000 people die from work-related stress annually. If we can trust the WHO, they report that working 55 hours or more per week raises the risk of stroke by 35% and the risk of death by heart disease by 17%. If I add it up, it comes to somewhere around 1 million people per year in the US alone. All directly attributable to work? I don't know, and I can't really prove it. Is working a major contributor? Undoubtedly. This is a line of argument I am particularly sensitive about. As I've said before, I spent the majority of my career working for a tobacco company. Number of deaths linked to the products my company made? A shockingly high number, I suspect. At the same time, I think the vitriol aimed at big tobacco is over the top and could be spread across a plethora of industries chugging away unmolested in every corner of our lovely little planet. I am personally uncomfortable with equating anything bad for your health with murder. After all, the food industry in general, auto industry, professional sports, alcohol, where do you stop? While I respect the importance of the debate, I am not interested in demonizing massive cross-segments of our society on this basis. As much as I detest what humanity is doing to itself, I also detest the idea of telling anyone what to do. But aside from whether homicide is the appropriate term or not, the majority of humanity are told working is admirable, desirable, honorable, or even necessary, compulsory, something that should be foisted on even the most passionate work resistor and rebels. Does anyone care that work robs us of our health, safety, and sanity? Only a small handful. How many people in our modern world are encouraged to take up the glorious, wonderful habit of smoking? Absolutely no one. It seems we're a confusingly selective species, are we not? Quote, "Bad news for liberals. Regulatory tinkering is useless in this life and death context. The Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration was designed to police the core part of the problem, workplace safety. Even before Reagan and the Supreme Court stifled it, OSHA was a farce. At previous and, by current standards, generous Carter-era funding levels, a workplace could expect a random visit from an OSHA inspector once every 46 years. State control of the economy is no solution. Work is, if anything, more dangerous in the state socialist countries than it is here. Thousands of Russian workers were killed or injured building the Moscow subway. Stories reverberate about covered-up Soviet nuclear disasters, which make Times Beach and the 3 Mile Island look like elementary school air raid drills. On the other hand, deregulation, currently fashionable, won't help and will probably hurt. From a health and safety standpoint, among others, work was at its worst in the days when the economy most closely approximated laissez-faire. Historians like Eugene Genovese have argued pervasively that, as antebellum slavery apologists insisted, factory wage workers in the northern American states and in Europe were worse off than southern plantation slaves. No rearrangement of relations among bureaucrats and businessmen seems to make much of a difference at the point of production. Serious enforcements of even the rather vague standards enforceable in theory by OSHA would probably bring the economy to a standstill. The enforcers apparently appreciate this, since they don't even try to crack down on most malefactors." Close quote. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration is a U.S. regulatory body set up 50 years ago, as of April 28, 1971, when it was established under the Occupational Safety and Health Act. This organization replaced the Bureau of Labor Standards, formed in 1922. The agency is responsible for enforcing labor standards, providing training, outreach, education, and enforcing the whistleblower statutes and regulations. Bob talks about how the agency is wholly insufficient for its mandate. This is a situation that has not changed nor improved. In the excerpt, Bob mentions that a workplace could expect a visit from an OSHA inspector once every 46 years. I found the following more recent quote enlightening. Quote, "OSHA is a small agency, given the size of its mission. With its state partners, OSHA has approximately 2,400 inspectors covering more than 8 million workplaces, where 130 million workers are employed. In the fiscal year 2012, ending September 30th, OSHA and its state partners conducted more than 83,000 inspections of workplaces across the United States, just a fraction of the nation's work sites. According to a report by the AFL-CIO, it would take OSHA 129 years to inspect all workplaces under its jurisdiction." Close quote. I won't dive into Bob's point around Soviet workers, as the communist governments of Eastern Europe and Russia have ceased to exist, although I will confirm that my 7 years living in Vietnam verifies that the plight of workers in that purportedly communist country are not better than in other countries. But also, in my own opinion, making the distinction between seemingly communist countries and also purportedly democratic capitalist countries on this topic is meaningless. In both cases, it is far better to be an employer than an employee. This is where Bob is being quite consistent. He is railing against the power relations in paid, forced labor arrangements, not about the underlying economic principles. When one group are given power over another, and they can further their situation through exercising that power, Sadly, they tend to abuse and mistreat the powerless. At the same time, most countries do not make protecting workers a high priority. As a point of comparison, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has a budget of approximately $150 billion US, while agriculture employs 3 million workers. The output of America's firms contributes 0.6% of the U.S. GDP. The OSHA covers 130 million workers across all parts of the economy and has a budget of approximately $500 million US, or 300 times less than agriculture. So, not outrageous to say that the OSHA is a low priority in the U.S. The essay continues, quote, "What I've said so far ought not be controversial. Many workers are fed up with work. There are high and rising rates of absenteeism, turnover, employee theft, and sabotage, wildcat strikes, and overall gold-bricking on the job. There may be some movement towards a conscious and not just visceral rejection of work, and yet the prevailing feeling, universal among bosses and their agents, and also widespread among workers themselves, is that work itself is inevitable and necessary." Close quote. I won't comment much on this paragraph. I agree with Bob. There are massive problems with workplace harassment, bullying, safety, health protection, bias and racism, equal access, and on and on. I also will agree with Bob that most employers and most employees feel that work itself is inevitable, necessary, or even good. But I will caution about his comment there are high and rising rates of absenteeism and so on. He does not provide a reference for this comment, and I'm not sure that he is correct. We are living 35 years in his future, and the rates of productivity have risen massively. Of course, technology and a lot of other elements affect this number, yet it also seems inconsistent with a generalized worker revolt. I also believe that the current anti-work movement is an indication of huge pent-up frustration about our work culture and treatment of workers. I would like to see the movement become so generalized and militant that it caused a shift in general social attitudes. Personally, I'm not hopeful, but that won't stop me from preaching. Quote, "I disagree. It is now possible to abolish work and replace it, insofar as it serves useful purposes with a multitude of new kinds of free activities. To abolish work requires going at it from two directions, quantitative and qualitative. On the one hand, on the quantitative side, we have to cut down massively on the amount of work being done. At present, most work is useless or worse, and we should simply get rid of it. On the other hand, and I think this is the crux of the matter and the revolutionary new departure, we have to take what useful work remains and transform it into a pleasing variety of game-like and craft-like pastimes, indistinguishable from other pleasurable pastimes, except that they happen to yield useful end products. Surely that shouldn't make them less enticing to do. Then all the artificial barriers of power and property could come down. Creation could become recreation. And we could all stop being afraid of each other." Close quote. If I'd read this paragraph a year or two ago, I think I might have found myself in a state of profound cognitive dissonance. The idea that we could simply eliminate a huge chunk of work with no real loss to the world is an idea that I'd not ever considered. Since that time, I've done a lot of reading and am now becoming very comfortable with the idea. If you've never encountered the writing of David Graeber, 1961-2020, then I urge you, with the greatest of enthusiasm, to pick up his book, Bullshit Jobs. By the way, Graeber's thesis advisor for his PhD was Marshall Salins. To quote just one small passage from his amazing book, quote, "There seems to be a general rule that the more obviously one's work benefits other people, the less one is likely to be paid for it." Close quote. Effectively, and in great detail, Graeber points out how there has been a huge expansion of the amount of deeply dissatisfying and meaningless work, much of it well paid. Among this grouping, you will find many administrators, lawyers, managers, and specialists. But at the same time, most of our necessary jobs, janitors, homemakers, nurses, farmers, and mechanics, among many others, are paid a pittance. This seems extremely counterintuitive to anyone raised under classical economic theory, where production of value should result in oodles of cold, hard cash. Graeber arrives in his book at exactly the same place as Bob has. That if we only allowed employees to stop doing all of the mindless, horrifying bullshit and shared the necessary but often difficult work around in novel ways, we'd all end up better off. No great collapse of our civilization, we'd still have food and clothes and homes, but we'd all have more leisure time while wasting far less energy, resources, and mental effort on unnecessary things. You know, the fast fashion, the drawers of iPhone adapters made necessary by designed obsolescence, and the ridiculous amount of marketing, the redundant excessive packaging, server farms full of random data, and so on. Quote, I don't want to suggest that most work is salvageable in this way, but then most work isn't worth trying to save. Only a small and diminishing fraction of work serves any useful purpose independent of the defense and reproduction of the work system and its political and legal appendages. 20 years ago, Paul and Percival Goodman estimated that just 5% of the work being done, presumably the figure, if accurate, is lower now, would satisfy our minimal needs for food, clothing, and shelter. Theirs was only an educated guess, but the main point is quite clear. Directly or indirectly, most work serves the unproductive purposes of commerce and social control. Right off the bat, we can liberate tens of millions of salesmen, soldiers, managers, cops, stockbrokers, clergymen, bankers, lawyers, teachers, landlords, security guards, admin, and everyone who works for them. There is a snowball effect, since every time you idle some big shot, you liberate his flunkies and underlings too. Thus, the economy implodes. 40% of the workforce are white-collar workers, most of whom have some of the most tedious and idiotic jobs ever concocted. Entire industries, insurance and banking and real estate, for instance, consist of nothing but useless paper shuffling. It is no accident that the tertiary sector, the service sector, is growing while the secondary sector, industry, stagnates, and the primary sector, agriculture, nearly disappears. Because work is unnecessary except to those whose power it secures, workers are shifted from relatively useful to relatively useless occupations as a measure to assure public order. Anything is better than nothing. That's why you can't go home just because you've finished early. They want your time, enough of it to make you theirs, even if they have no use for most of it. Otherwise, why hasn't the average work week gone down by more than a few minutes in the last 50 years? Close quote. Again, all of this is covered convincingly and in more detail in Bullshit Jobs. The original essay upon which the book was based is available online and is a short, interesting read. I will add a link in the description. One of the areas that Bob doesn't take on, and I think is an important concern, is the increasing use of emotional labor. Emotional labor was a concept first identified by sociologist Arlie Hochschild, 1940 to current, in a 1983 book, The Managed Heart. For instance, flight attendants are trained to suppress their own fear or anxiety in emergency situations. Bill collectors are often trained to imagine debtors as lazy and to feel suspicious. Quote, in the era of COVID-19, she argues, many frontline workers do the emotional labor of bracketing heightened anxieties about their own health and that of their families while dealing with the fear, anxiety, and sometimes hostility of the public. Close quote. While we tend to imagine the downsides of labor being subordination and alienation, plus maybe instances of outright abuse, Emotional labor reaches into the worker's psyche and demands more than general submission. Active cooperation through taking on the attitudes and beliefs of the employer as well. It's like being asked to become a consummate actor. But whereas an actor might perform for a few hours of the day with long breaks in between, the emotional laborer is expected to pretend to be someone else for 8 or more hours a day, day after day, week after week, and year after year. Where normal labor tends to an exhaustion of the body and mind, emotional labor is an exhaustion of the soul. And I think it's time to close with this part of the video series. Thanks so much for following along. If you'd like to be notified of upcoming parts of this essay, then please subscribe. As always, this is XCG, wishing you speed and ease on your journey to freedom.